like to follow along as we talk about 2 Samuel 6, it's right there in your lectionary leaflet. And David is now moving the neglected ark to his new capital in order to place God back in the center of communal life. It is a shrewd, consolidated move of his political power. And the reason I say this is because we have to remember what we talked about 2 weeks ago when he made Jerusalem his capital, because Jerusalem was a neutral site. It was not owned by either the northern part of the kingdom or the southern part of the kingdom. So it was very much an independent state. And isn't it interesting that he calls it the city of David, because it was David and his men who capture it, not the tribes of Judah or the tribes of Ishkar or Dan or any of those other tribes. So into the city of David comes David, or at least he wants to come, with the Ark of the Covenant. And as we read all, and I know some of you struggle with some of the stories in these scriptures. Okay, I do too. Okay, let's get that right out of the way. But if you just pick and choose, if you cherry pick, then you miss a lot of opportunities to struggle with some very important themes in the scriptures. So, if we leave out the story of the death of Uzzah and the rejection of Michal, which is at the beginning and at the end, it's fundamentally a different story. David danced before the ark. Let's do some liturgical dancing. Yah-ho, yah-ha, and we can all get out of here. All right? No, that's not what it's about. The ark needs to be reflected upon. And that was the seat of which God sat on. And in the ark were the 10 Commandments. The ark had struck terror among the Philistines after they had captured it in 1 Samuel 5 and 6. Matter of fact, it was so bad that they had rats and tumors and everything running around their cities. And they finally say to the Israelites, "Get this thing out of here. We don't want it. We thought we wanted it, but we don't." It eventually was housed in Kiriath Jearim for at least 20 years under the care of Eleazar, the son, as we heard today, of Abinadab. And now David wants to move the ark to Jerusalem. So the question is, why does he want to move it there? And his initial motive is never given. So we could spend the rest of the day wondering and questioning what is his motive. And then there's the story of poor Uzzah. And the question that we need to ask very honestly, what did Uzzah do wrong? The oxen stumbled. He simply put out his hand to perhaps steady the ark, and all of a sudden God's wrath is kindled against him. That's a horrible story on its basis. But perhaps we should look below the text at what the authors were thinking. Yes, the ark was sacred. And yes, the ark was not to be treated with indifference or handled presumptuously. But this does seem rash and harsh and places God in a very difficult light. Perhaps the point of this strange story may well be that encounter with God is a risky business, not to be taken casually or lightly, as is frequently our custom. David learns that as the Lord can burst out against the Philistines, so the Lord can now burst out within Israel. And in the short term, our dear friend Uzzah pays most for that lesson. And then chapter 6 also finalizes the move from kinship to kingship, which is why it's such an important chapter in the scriptures. The time of the judges is now officially over. The north and south are now joined together, and the allegiance to Saul is now over, and all the factions are united around this young king. As Professor Neese said earlier, David's dancing before the ark and his exuberance can be read both as pure gratitude for what the Lord has granted him and as politically astute manipulation. He said, David's motives are not pure, and yet God is involved. That's an important lesson. Sometimes our motives are not pure, but God can still be involved. Sin is real, and faith is real. And at times they are concurrent in one event and one character. The narrative leaves room for both readings, not one. Perhaps it even insists on both readings, and thus depicts a world, as he writes, that has resonance with our very own, which is why I love these texts. The Lord blesses David, but as the text points out again and again and again, David is self-serving and conniving. He is not all bad, my friends, nor is he all good. David is like each of us. We strive to do good, but there are times when our actions are self-serving and far, far away from the way of God. Yet God continues to love us, and nothing separates us from that love of God. And to me, that's the mind-blowing experience. The mind-blowing experience. The end of our passage states that all the people went home. And if I was a political prognosticator, I would say that David's approval ratings that day went through the roof. Why did they go through the roof? What did he do at the end of the lesson? Or when he finally got everything back into Jerusalem and he made sacrifices? What did he do? He gave food to everybody. Bread, meat, and those raisin cakes. Yeah? So of course, I'm sure everybody loved David that day, except one woman. One woman looked out from the windows of the palace, and as it says, I believe in the 16th verse, she despised David in her heart. Wow. When David gets back into the house, David sharply rebukes Michal. Let's just be reminded for just a second who Michal is. Michal was the daughter of Saul and was given to David in marriage. Then when David went against Saul and became a fugitive, Saul gave Michal to another man. All right? Then, if you remember, when David comes into power and he's making a deal with the tribes, the elders of Judah, he says, oh yeah, and by the way, I want one thing. I want my wife back. So poor Michal has to be taken and given back to David, while her second husband walks behind her absolutely distressed. It's really a horrible story, an absolutely horrible story for our dear Michal. So that's the background. So David gets back to the palace, and he will sharply rebuke her when she basically says, well, weren't you the king's meow today? Dancing in front of the ark with all of your might, in front of all those virgins and all those girls who just loving it up. You're a fool, David. And David rebukes her sharply, stating that the Lord has chosen him over her father's house. And then the narrator adds that Michal had no children to the day of her death. That's an interesting text. Many interpreters understand this data as a judgment on Michal and give reasons to justify it, assuming that the Lord had made her barren. But I think there's room for another interpretation. I believe that the writer of the text is simply trying to tie up the storylines, protecting David's monarchy. Were Michal to have children, the threat of Saul's line would still remain. Her barrenness completes the choice of David and the rejection of Saul. In one sense, this story is about politics and not the struggles between a husband and a wife. Because Michal loved David. It says so in 1 Samuel, and Michal had even saved David's life by informing him of Saul's intent to kill him and letting David down through a window in 1 Samuel 19. Michal's story is a sad one, for her love for David is never supported. She is used only to advance the male-sided story of the kingdom and power. But the books of Samuel have another way, another reality that David ignores at his own peril. Because the books of Samuel begin in the Lord's regard for another childless woman. Her name was Hannah, the mother of Samuel, who sings the very same words that Mary will sing when she says, my spirit rejoices in God. Yeah? When she sings the Magnificat. And the words are almost the same in 1 Samuel. Hannah's song testified to the Lord's commitment to reverse the fortunes of the oppressed and the exploited. And David has known this reversal of grace himself as his rise as God's chosen one from a shepherd boy to a king. And yet, for some reason, he forgets the origins of his story. I love these stories. I love these stories. And I hope you will come to love them as much as I do, because there is so much in them to reflect upon and consider. The stories are rich because they still speak to our own time and day. So things to ponder as you move forth from this place today. 1, what do we do with the holiness of God? Or do we try to put God in a neat little box that we can manipulate or open up whenever we are in some need, forgetting about the majesty, the power, the glory, and the holiness of God? 2, the treatment of women in the Bible. And I wish we had time, and maybe we will do this sometime, to think about the women in the book of Samuel, in the books of Samuel. Because start with Hannah, who God blesses, Michal, who God seems to curse and just use her to move the plot along, and Bathsheba, who is used, but then uses the king. It's fascinating how women are treated in very, very different ways, and we should look at it carefully. And how does this compare to our own day and time? Do we refuse to love for the sake of power? Do we disregard women's interests as irrelevant to the public interest? And do we honor God while not fully honoring the priorities to which God has called us? And finally, I think the most important lesson out of chapter 6 is simply this. David is not all bad. David is good. And he's just like us. And the thing that we need to remember as we move forth from today is that God still loves and blesses him and blesses us each and every day. My friends, keep struggling with the stories from 2 Samuel. They're good stories. They're our stories. Let us find the truth in them. I've said these things today in the name of God, who is known as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.